talked in the last time how the Renaissance develops, how it's directed by many of the rich and the powerful, and how ultimately the nature of how the art is produced changes because of the Reformation. The feeling of Northern Protestantism, but particularly of Calvinism, is that these are filthy idols, wipe them out, we don't need them. And the Catholic response is largely, well, what about people who can't read? What do they do? And surely they should have some way to encounter God when they can't read the sacred page. So the church goes, and especially in Rome. Now Rome, the popes had been spending a lot of money, especially starting with Julius II, to turn it from a medieval backwater, which it had been since at least the Avignon papacy, and to a medieval dump, really, is what it was, until the times largely starting with Aeneas Sylvius, who becomes Pius II, forgive me. Then you go through Alexander VI kind of spends most of the money on himself, but then Julius II, who names himself not after the early pope and martyr Julius I, but after Julius Caesar, because he's going to make war on all these local principalities that have eaten up papal territory in order to get it back. Well, he uses a lot of this money. He's paying Raphael, like we saw, Michelangelo. He's paying for all the upgrades. And so rebuilding St. Peter's is one of those major upgrades. So Rome is positioning itself at the heart of the Counter-Reformation now, 1530s, 1540s, to basically be the heart. So everyone's coming there for pilgrimages. The interest in the early church, the early martyrs whose bones and bodies and relics are in Rome. His increase of pilgrims are coming from everywhere. So now all the cardinals, all the big patrons, they're paying to get the best artists to get into churches, to get their artwork into churches. And so there's money now that there didn't used to be. And since people like Albrecht Dürer, and then really more than anyone else, even Michelangelo, preached the cult of the artist. And I don't have time really to talk about that very much. Art is now possibly a way, if you could handle the mediums and make your mark, you could make a lot of money. So where we start then, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, right, is born in 1582. He is born from a very poor family, but they're tenant farmers in Milan, so they actually have a decent income now, managing some of the outskirts here outside the city. The major force in Milan at that time was St. Charles Borromeo. Now, Borromeo is a really interesting figure. So he was a cardinal in Rome, and the 1540s or so, not really great, not really bad. And then something revolutionary happened to him. He was a layman, by the way, as a lay cardinal, and the family was trying to manage all the money through ecclesiastical absenteeism and benefices to get Charles all these benefices as a lay cardinal, and then later he'd marry, keep the money in the family, and that's the way it was going to work. Borromeo reads the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and he's on fire. He now, all of a sudden, so he realizes he's been wasting his life, so he starts feeding the poor from his own table. If you go to Santa Maria Maggiore, one of the big basilica to Our Lady, St. Mary Major, the table at which St. Charles Borromeo used to feed the poor when he was a cardinal is actually preserved there. You can see it, have it behind the window. So Charles then, he gets, he hears wind that his family is going to get him to marry, so he goes and finds a bishop to ordain him a priest, so secretly. So now it's done. Can't have that happen. So now he's a cardinal priest. Then he becomes Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, and he desperately wants to go. But Pius V is like, I know, but you're such a good administrator, I can't afford to lose you. So after enough importuning, St. Pius V allows Borromeo to take residence in Milan, and he sends a few Jesuits ahead of him to kind of prepare the ground. And then he enters the city in this grand procession. Milan was a bad place. The expression was, si vuoi andare all'inferno, essere un prete. If you want to go to hell, be a priest. Because priests, often having their income from the church, would carry swords and guns in public. They were a little better than gangsters. And there would be priests who were clients of various families that lived in open concubinage. It was a bad situation. They were the worst of the bunch in general. Then you had the Spanish technically controlled Milan. And so Charles V was the king of Spain, and then he gives that title to Philip II in order that he would be a king when he went to England to marry Queen Mary. So the Spanish kind of run Milan, but the old Sforza dynasty and their patrons are still in the city. They're kind of the aristocracy and the elite. So Charles Borromeo upsets all the power politics. who between them are perfectly happy for souls to fall in hell as long as they're making money. So Charles comes in with annual preaching. Priests that wouldn't renounce their concubines were thrown out of the priesthood altogether. The churches were renovated, artwork was put in. And so Borromeo transforms the city, and he becomes like the very model of a reforming bishop, who has as his inspiration St. Ambrose, who's one of the greatest bishops of that see, and St. John Fisher, who is known as being the holiest bishop in Christendom, who was martyred by Henry VIII. So those were the portraits, the guiding lights he had in his cell as he went to do his work. So one of the big places is artwork. How are we going to inspire the faithful to have a religious sense? So one of the things he had to do was employ the various ideas of the Council of Trent and its teachings on things like paganism in art, nudity in art. And actually, there's a great conversation that probably should be had. Don't really have too much time to really take it seriously in our format, but the difference between nudity and erotica, right? And there is a difference. So there's a level of idealized nudity you could have in art. As a reaction to elements of the pagan Renaissance, Borromeo just says, none at all. We don't want any at all. The one thing that the Council of Trent said that kind of stood, and obviously the moral principles it rests on are pretty obvious, is that you couldn't paint from nude models directly. That should be obvious why that is, but it wasn't to some, and a lot of people flouted it. It was only Pope Paul V who kind of gradually said, well, you should pay attention to that, but you really don't have to, because Paul V had a lot of friends and patrons in the art world, and they didn't want to give that up. So nudity that doesn't cause what St. Alphonsus calls delectatio morosa, or morose delectation, basically means being aroused sexually. If that doesn't happen, then, if that, like a normal man of average virtue looks at it and doesn't feel this arousement, this is an idealized nudity. But there's some art, and this is usually just called erotica, that's its purpose is to cause that, and that's always and everywhere forbidden. Right? You can't do that. But there's a certain level in which nudity can be idealized, the Sistine Chapel being an obvious example, in other places, and still have a Christian message. But in this period, this is all being cut away as a reaction to the pagan Renaissance. We don't even want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Let's just leave it alone. So what Borromeo does is he wants to see a lot of sculpture. He wants to see a lot of things with depth and emotion. So there's like societies all around in Milan. So they would set up hospitals and do great religious work so that people dying in hospitals could look at them and see these great things before they die. Or again, criminals, right? So let's take Steve over here. And let's say Steve was condemned to death and he's being led out to the gallows, right, to be hanged or whatever cruel thing they're going to do to him. And the last thing that would happen is, before he got there, they would have some kind of scene in a church set up specifically for this purpose. Some type of a great work of art, the Christ on the cross, Christ being taken down from the cross, some great pious work. So you can sit there for a few minutes. So in this case, Steve can sit there for just a few minutes, meditating on this particular work. And then there would be a confessor handy, so he could have his confession heard and receive last rites. Because actually theologians taught that it was the prince had a moral obligation when men were put to death to make certain that confessors were available for them to hear confession. And if it happened early enough, like the day before, they could even receive communion. But they just had to make sure it wasn't close enough to the execution time. So so this is one of the things you would do, try to inspire the salvation of that soul at the last second before they're about to expire, be expired, as the case may be. So this is the Sacro Monte at Viraldo in what's now Piedmont. At that time it was in the environs of Milan. And so Borromeo himself commissioned a whole bunch of scenes from the life of Christ. This is the massacre of the innocents from the Bible, which Herod commands. You see Herod in the background commanding all this. And so you see this gruesome, brutal, he's sticking the sword right into that baby. This is, today we would place rated R right on that. Oh no, that's a horrific image. No one can see that. And it's extremely violent. And this is really the character of a lot of northern Italian art, right? So with this one, because the violence is a regular pattern of life. This is a very violent age, even in Christian Europe, even in the heart of Rome itself. It's a really violent place to be. And so this level of violence, it reminds you life is short. You see the horror. It's meant to provoke the emotion so that you see it and you feel this compunction, this sadness. And you see what these babies went through as martyrs for our Savior to escape to Egypt. So Caravaggio grows up in this environment, and this is kind of what he interacts with. His name is Michelangelo. He's named so because he's born on September 29th, the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. So he gets that name. So he's not to be confused with the other Michelangelo who does the Sistine Chapels. That's why we'll just call him by da Caravaggio, right, his town name where he's from. So his father dies, and his grandfather, and his uncle, all on the same day because of a plague that had broken out. Then, so he was apprenticed to an artist who was a fresco artist. He was a disciple of Tiziano, who was a famous Venetian artist that I would have loved to have talked about. We didn't have enough time. And Caravaggio then doesn't really learn a whole lot from him. This is clear from his early work that he starts producing in Rome. So whatever he was supposed to learn with this other artist he was apprenticed to, he really didn't learn it. The only thing he might have learned that would have helped him is the production of paints, all that laborious process we spoke of in the last talk. Very complicated. So his mother dies when Caravaggio is 19, and so the family sells up and decides it's time to head somewhere else. And they decide to head to Rome. So Rome in the 1590s is a complicated place. So remember that it's a mostly male city. Okay, we think of the palaces of cardinals, we think of St. Peter's, you think of these great churches, but the Rome in which Caravaggio walked into was a very different Rome. All right, with the beggars, not just the beggars though, the shifty part-time soldiers who would cut your throat just as well as take your purse if they just didn't like you or just didn't feel like they should like you that particular day. You have people laboring away in the streets, old garlic, sour wine, prostitutes, all laboring away over here in the Ottaccio, the Ripetta, over across the Tiber. Now, Ottaccio means bad garden. It comes from a medieval district of that city. And so when St. Pius V wanted to remove all the harlots from the city. And he was prevailed upon that this would be very bad for public order because of the various contagions. St. Thomas talks about this a little bit in a much famously quoted and misquoted passage where he's talking about tolerating an evil for the sake of not having a worse evil in public disorder. And of course, ambassadors, right, all these guys, you couldn't just say, well, let's get them in, because those are the ambassadors and the dignitaries and the aristocrats. And so it's like, all right, Pius V says, well, let's lock them up and over across the Tiber, over in the Ottaccio. So it gets the name Evil Eden, right, because of the nature of what's going on there. So this is cheap housing, and this is where Caravaggio ends up, in the midst of this very violent environment, a lot of thievery, a lot of complicated problems. And so he lives, with other perpetually broke painters, all looking to be the next one to land his plum commission and be the next Michelangelo and strike it filthy rich. And that's where they're aiming at, whereas the church is looking for the one who can give us the artwork that's going to inspire and save souls. So hopefully this all comes out into a win-win relationship. The Pope at the time, Pope Clement VIII, was a very humane man and tried as best as he could to manage the complicated problems with Rome in terms of the crime, the economics of it all. And he was a very humane man. St. Philip Neri was his spiritual director. And he made Cardinal Baronius a cardinal just on the basis of his holiness, even though Baronius didn't want to be a cardinal. Same thing for St. Robert Bellarmine, didn't want to be a cardinal, right, or kind of forced into it by Clement VIII. So he was very, very judicious, prudential for the most part, but not in everything. So there's a lot of complications in the city. The next thing is that acquiring the paints and getting Caravaggio just didn't have enough money to really get started. So some of the ancient accounts tell us that he's sitting there doing painting a groat a head, that he'd paint people's portraits, paint like a head for a groat, and a groat isn't a lot of money. In fact, a groat is the similar word in German, Groschen. It's like in Austria, used to have this money, it was called Groschen. And they're basically like tokens, they're actually plastic because of the lack of value. This is before the euro, that is. And so because of their lack of value. So the same thing in Italy at the time, a groat was a very small amount of money, not worth very much. And so he's doing his best to make money however he can. He switches apprentices, and who he's working for is he's paid badly. Sometimes he's wanted just because, oh, you're from Lombardy, right? So you can do fruit and landscapes and stuff like that. They didn't think he could really do anything great. So one of his first better paintings is this, Bacchus. Well, sort of, Bacchus after a fashion. So what's happening here is one of the things that artists are told to do in this time is, all right, well, if you want to be good artists, go tour around the city, copy the great masters, Raphael, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, watch what these people have done, draw old sculpture, plenty of that lying around, just learn from the masters. And Caravaggio, he didn't really draw. He didn't want to learn from the tradition. He wanted to make his mark doing something different. And so one of the things is that, again, the prevalence of pagan mythology now being repurposed for Christian moral messages are ubiquitous, even culturally. You didn't have to be educated to be familiar with a lot of the stories and say Ovid. You wouldn't have read Ovid necessarily as a peasant, but you would know those stories and you would know those references because they're written right into the language. Bacchus, the god of wine, binges, but he's also the god of eternal youth and joy. So Caravaggio does a self-portrait as the sick Bacchus, as a Bacchus who's practically on death's door. Even his laurel crown is withering away. And you see here the grapes past their sell-by date. I don't know if I want to eat those. Oily pores, right? He's, this Bacchus, eternal youth and beauty, he's looking really sick. So what Caravaggio is getting at in this particular painting is that instead of like the Renaissance where they're making men into gods, this is the whole point. See, like Da Vinci's famous drawing of like man, the absolute perfections of man. Michelangelo, absolutely trying to show the perfections of men. It makes men godlike. Caravaggio is turning a god into a man, mortal, sick, as in basically how he views the slavish copying of the classics. He tries some other things to catch a nobleman's eye, catch a cardinal's eye, see if he can get someone to buy a painting. So the boy with the canestra dei frutti, the basket of fruit. There's a lot of things that actually are going on in this what is otherwise simply, there's a guy holding a basket of fruit. Okay, what's going on here? The fruit, it's actually similar to, there's another image where he takes this up. There's a classical illusion, which he may or may not have known about, at least at this stage, of the painter Apelles, who's a famous painter in antiquity. And Apelles had a contest with a rival artist for who could paint fruit that looked so real that a bird would come over and try to eat it. And so this is one of those things that this time Caravaggio tries a couple of times to get the fruit that looks so good that if a bird came, a bird would actually see it and want to eat it, right? But there's more to it than just that particular ancient story. So the boy, very youthful, very attractive features, and it's actually harking back to the bridegroom of the Song of Songs. And the fruit, right, is evidence of fertility, but also hope. Cherries in the mix, right? So these ancient symbols, of course, grapes for wine, mirth, wholesomeness. The cherries, remember again, the passion, death of Christ, the resurrection. The apples too, but it's all mixed in. It's all kind of mixed up, and so he's not trying to get the symbols that way. But thinking back in the bridegroom of the Song of Songs, and this is the fertility, the abundance that he's possessing. And here, of course, the Bacchus, again, this is his friend, Mario Minuti. And you've seen this picture, I'm sure, on a number. You see it in wine bottles, you see it in books, you see it in all sorts of places. But with some of the interesting distinctions here, you see, so here's the carafe of wine. It's already open, and it's already been gone through a bit. It's not filled to the top. The glass here, so the calyx, it's a very wide, it's a brim, and that actually comes from ancient Greece. If everyone's heard of symposia, right? Plato's symposium. Well, the symposia were actual places where you'd come together, and they were sort of a social club. So like Plato's dialogue, the symposium, they banish all the women and decide, all right, we're not going to get drunk tonight, because last night we were so drunk we couldn't even talk. So they get rid of all this and in order so they could talk philosophy. And so one of the things they would do is you'd have to recline on a couch, Roman style, and drink wine from this calyx. It would be very, very wide and very awkward to handle. It had little eyes on it. So that as you're looking out at society's watching you to make sure you follow the norms right. You drink this right, so we don't have to kick you out of here. So so that's why you have these very wide calyxes that are used a lot of times in art. Even the people didn't actually drink from them that often, and certainly not in Roman fashion. But what's interesting here is you see the ripples, little thing, the ripples in the wine. See, can I zoom out? If I can, I don't know how to do it. Oh well. Anyway, so the ripple effect in the wine is showing that he's tipsy. He's already had a bit, and he can't hold the glass straight, right? It's part of the illusion for who Bacchus is supposed to be, as this typical Roman type of god. Again, the fruit, notice, right? So he's using a lot of that in these paintings. But this is the one where he adds a layer, really interesting layer of distinction. That's another one in his early period, currently in the London Gallery, and I forget how it got there, but so it might be harder to see. I should have lightened it up. So there's a lizard here that's biting his finger, right? And then we have apples down here, hearkening back to the apple in the Garden of Eden. But what's really going on, it's interesting, which finger is being bit by the lizard? The digitus indignus, as the Romans call it, the middle one, right? Which we know for so many colorful gestures we can make in modern culture. But they made them then too. And it actually had a certain meaning, so that it actually becomes, in a way, a certain phallic symbol, and you point it and accuse someone of being homosexual. And that was the original purpose of that finger gesture. So without demonstrating or going further into it, the lizard is biting. Now, what are lizards? Lizards are creepy, crawly things. They go on their belly, and that harkens back to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So anything lizard in art usually means something bad. And here, so the lizard's biting on to his middle finger. So it's what the sign is, and it's Bacchus, and Bacchus is somewhat androgynous. It's suggestive of certain, inclinations, shall we say. And in those times too, in the Renaissance, you did have a problem with the resurgence of sodomy, particularly in Florence, right? It was a big problem that was kind of on the rise and then going away, and then we see it in our own times, unfortunately. So what's happening is there's a little moral message here, right? You got the cherries right below where the lizard is, because the passion and death of Christ is also a judgment to sinners. And here he's being bit in that finger, symbolizing this type of bad behavior, as in these type of sins can kill you. And that's really where he's going with it. Probably painted for a private patron. We don't know anything about the circumstances of how that was painted. And so here's another one, again, another variation on the fruit, but there's something interesting that he's done here that's entirely uncharacteristic of his age, right? So one thing you remember with the Bacchus, turning a god into a mortal, dying man. Fruit was one of those things, when you painted it, you wanted it to be perfect. You wanted it to be ripe. You wanted it to be one of these things that you had to eat. Right? And if you didn't want to find things like a worm in it and these sort of things. So what he's done is interesting, is that he's turned something as simple as a basket of fruit into a life and death drama, right? The worms through the apple. Right? You've got your figs, the leaves are withering here, showing nature is taking its time. And it's taking its effect on the fruit, right? The fruit is not immortal. Now also, and this harkens back again to that story of the Pele's. Can I make the fruit so perfect a bird would eat from it? And in the story, and this is probably where he has some awareness of that story, because in it, Apelles sees that a bird comes near and it flies away, and he realizes his fault. He made the fruit so perfect, no bird would think it was real. So Caravaggio's trying to outdo Apelles. Let's get fruit that a bird would see as real. And I don't know the result of that if the birds really came down to eat it. So the various places where he worked, getting into some trouble, because one of the reasons we know a bit about Caravaggio's life is he's a very dodgy character, and he shows up in a number of police reports quite a bit. So he needs his way out if he's ever going to make his mark. And so now it's time to catch a cardinal. There's one cardinal comes by the art markets, Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. We'll get to him in a minute. So Caravaggio gets a little bit of his biography and paints a picture meant to ensnare him. It's somewhat biographical. So this is called the Cardsharps. And there's a lot of nudge, nudge, wink, wink in the developments, because you wouldn't obviously do that in public when you're cheating someone. But you have the obvious image, the young rosy-cheeked nobleman that's kind of clueless, kind of has no idea what he's getting into. And you have the fellow here. Why has he got holes in his gloves? It's not because he's too poor. It's because he needs that for sneaking around and tricks and pickpocketing and things of that sort. So then the young bravo, it's kind of humorous, right? He's obviously going to cheat the young nobleman who's entirely clueless. So there's a humor to it. It's something unique. It's something very different from what other people are painting. So Cardinal Del Monte is walking down into the Artaccio looking for artwork to pick up, and he sees this. It just catches his eye. So he buys it for a song, and then makes Caravaggio an offer he can't refuse. you seem like a clever fellow. How would you like to come live with me? Art, music, philosophy. Oh, you like all that stuff, don't you? And and that was kind of the purpose of the painting, to ensnare some cardinal that will pick him up as a patronus. And so that's what he does. So Del Monte lives in the Palazzo Madama, which is still there today, although it's gotten a lot more crowded. There's no streets around it anymore, but on the other sides. But I think it's a government building now, I forget. I haven't actually been inside of it, just around it. But Del Monte lived there. Now, cardinals had to live on an income. They would have an income that would come from benefices. They would hold a certain office. They would sometimes be bishops, and usually absentee bishops. This is one of the biggest plagues of the pre-Reformation church, is episcopal absenteeism. You're the bishop. You're supposed to be in some diocese administering it, but you're not. You're living somewhere else where you'd rather live, receiving all the money from that particular diocese. Well, you pay a vicar to do all the work for you, and usually they did it badly. So, and this is still going on. Now, Del Monte it was just a cardinal priest, and he received various benefices for things. He actually had a very modest salary as the way things went with cardinals. But he tried to use it very beneficially for the poor, right? And also musicians and other things. He actually is one of the people that helped reinvent opera, because he's with the various musicians he worked with. They actually worked on isolating the female voice from choir and making it what it was today, right? That wasn't done before. So one of Del Monte's main interests are in music. So with Caravaggio, now he's got someone with a lot of raw talent, just needs some direction. So he gets him some tutoring in Latin, some tutoring in some of the ancient, understandings of, mythology, poetry, how to work with these types of things and get the ideas in paint. But the musical interest is where he directs Caravaggio. So you have 4 youths in a closet. But there's a claustrophobia that's being brought in here. Right? And so remember, we talked about with Renaissance, a lot of times you're trying to make it real, trying to invite someone into that world. Right? And so that's part of the closeness, is demolishing the space between you, the viewer, and the painting viewed. And what do we have here? Just in case you didn't figure out, they're talking about love songs. You have Cupid over here, kind of, looking over things, and the boys tuning up. But they're not playing yet. This is a total departure from the convention of displaying music. You always get somebody playing music. And here, they're warming up, right? This one's still learning his lines. He's got his back to the viewer, so whatever he's going to play, he's still learning it, right? And there's Caravaggio in the back, and he's the whole thought of the experience. He's tearing up as he's thinking about it. But what's also interesting is where this would have hung in the Palazzo Madama is in the Hall of Music, where, because you didn't have TV in those days, so you would retire for a reading out of poetry and music. If you go through a lot of the old villas, the palazzos that used to belong to the nobility in Rome, you'll see a lot of really interesting rooms. This one's decorated like Roman stuff, or their conception of how the Romans lived. This one's in Greek. I went through in the palazzo that used to belong to the Abruzzi family, which is now the National Museum of Rome, of the actual city itself. There's a Chinese room. They got the Chinese all wrong, and they got other things, but that was the way they imagined it. So you would have an experience in this room, and you'd read something about that culture, about the history. You'd go in the Roman room and you'd read the Aeneid. You'd go in the Greek room and you'd read Pindar. You'd read the Iliad or something. And that's how they would kind of have this, experience. And then you go to the music hall, because you did not have CD players, you did not have MP3 players, you did not have record players, you did not have the phonograph. If you wanted music, you had to make it or go where someone was making it. And if you were the rich, you brought the people making it to you. And so we're a case of a cardinal. And Del Monte really loved music. And like I said, he's instrumental in the creation of opera. All the work that they do in Rome inspires Monteverdi, who has the oldest surviving operas, even though he's not the first one to make one. But anyway, so every time Del Monte would burst into the room, they're waiting for him. There are musicians here, so that basically what the effect is that they're not ready to play until Del Monte comes in, then the music starts. It's a really clever little effect. So then, he's trying to hone Caravaggio's interest. There's a number of other ones that he does in this period, but the biggest thing is church commissions. That's where the money's at. So there was a cardinal, a French cardinal, Comte Truel, at the Church of San Luigi dei Franceschi, the St. Louis of the French. And it's the French National Church of Rome, still is to this very day, actually. And so in that church, he had a special side altar set up, and they were supposed to, his first name was Matthew, and so his name gets Italianized to Cantorelli. And they wanted he wanted to have St. Matthew's life decorating the walls, originally in fresco. So various artists bid for the commission, and with Del Monte's help, Caravaggio gets it, right? And he gets into the church, and he looks, and he sees how big he's got to prepare this. It's bigger than anything he's done before. And he tells them, well, I can't do fresco. I'm not a fresco painter, so I'm going to do it. Big oil painting. And then, so they're indulgent. They say, okay, we'll let you do that. And then he's looking at the commission, saints on clouds, all the stuff he hates, right? Because he rubs shoulders with the poor and the downtrodden and the filthy. And he's like, people don't want to see saints up on clouds. And what he's talking about is what we call the Mannerist style, which I really like, actually, but it's got a huge disrepute in the art history field. A lot of people really don't like it. And because they prefer Caravaggio largely, or Rembrandt and things in that vein. There's a lot of good elements to it. Sometimes it is kind of tacky. It just depends on the artist and how inventive or not inventive they are. A lot of the ones in this period were not that inventive. And so Caravaggio doesn't want to see, he's not going to do this big surrealist, what was for him surreal, clouds and visions of paradise. Who knows about that? From where he comes from. He wants to do something literal. So he just gets a big headache looking at the martyrdom of Matthew. So he looks over at the calling of Matthew, and then the light goes on, because it's about a sinner like him, not about a saint. Well, he's a future saint, but in any event, he's basically taken, giving you this area where you've got this business going on, and most of them barely even take notice of these two figures coming in, Christ and St. Peter, in their garb, almost straight out of the Holy Land, almost as if they've been beamed into this little Roman tavern. There's even paper shades on the windows. Really seedy type of place. And everyone who saw this would have recognized this is a really seedy type of place that you probably don't want to be. You got the Cardsharps back reused for this amusing scene, right? If you really didn't see that. And then you have Matthew. Okay, you? Who? Me? And so they're drawing that in. He's been taken, notice, away from the county. But what about these guys? And what's interesting here is you've got the fellow with the glasses. Do I have to zoom up on that or no? I do. Okay. You've got this fellow with the glasses here, right? So the light that's coming in is too pure for the spiritually short-sighted, right? It's a really clever device, using the glasses for the guy who can't see. Right, because that's the exact opposite of what they're supposed to be. And then this fellow, he doesn't even notice. They're just counting up everything. And then, so it's also interesting. It's kind of a genius move on Caravaggio's part. Instead of making the whole thing about Christ, because it's about Matthew's calling, instead of showing more Christ, show less, cover him up. The less you see of him, the better. The less is more principle. Because it is about the calling of the saint. The more you have of Jesus, the less attention you have on that exact moment where Matthew is transformed from a scum money changer to Christ's disciple. And you've got to remember, too, the money changers back in those days, they're called publicans, the Latin word publicani. So the word comes as a publican in the English translations of the 16th century. The reason is the publicani were contract taxpayers, or tax farmers, essentially. So Rome would say, okay, I want X amount in taxes from this region. You say, okay, so you go in. Rome wants double the amount they told me, but you don't say that. Rome wants this amount of money, one for me and one for Rome, and one for me and one for Rome. And as long as Rome gets the money, they don't really care how much you're overcharging the people unless it becomes a problem. So tax collectors are not particularly liked in the Bible. Tax farmers in Italy and in France, they're also not particularly liked, same type of thing. So they have a sense, whereas we don't have that today, unless we're thinking of IRS agents, Otherwise, we're not really thinking about a tax farmer, right? Not in the way in those times anyway. So, and then the whole expression really captures the mood. Me? Yes, Matthew, you piece of scum. No saints for this work, just sinners like you. And that's the effect that Caravaggio wants you to get, because he has a deeply religious sense, and he's just had a troubled life getting there. And you could see, in a lot of his paintings, he's trying to work out. This is the moment he hopes he has, right? And it was interesting, if you notice the hand. Notice the hand. Remember the Sistine Chapel? That's the same, hand device of Adam. So also drawing that in this, and it would be a well-known thing, by the way. So he's copying the Michelangelo, because I, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, am going to be the better Michelangelo. So he copies that little device for the new Adam who's coming in. And you also see the feet. That's a little element that was usually considered too indecent to put in paintings, right? So the feet show he's already on his way out because Christ knows his grace is going to accomplish that effect. So with that problem solved, the problem of the calling of St. Matthew, he's able to turn around to the east side of the chapel, which if you go in the church, you see the main altar, it's like the last chapel up on the left side. If you go in, you could see the next figure leaning out. It looks totally different from everything else in the church. The martyrdom of Matthew. And if you're thinking of the movies, you're not wrong, right? There's an element, Martin Scorsese, love him or hate him, I think probably a few here love him, which is good. But he looks at Caravaggio as a major inspiration for how he does his filmography. And he says that Caravaggio is really the founder of cinematography. The way he uses the light and dark, which we'll talk about in a minute, is able to highlight certain elements that he wants the viewer to get. Right? And so here he takes, this is from the Golden Legend of Varenne, who writes about Matthew going to Ethiopia in order to convert everybody. And so he's converted some of the royal princesses, and the king is very upset. So he sends a pagan hitman to come after him, and basically who martyrs him in the course while he was doing a baptism. And that's what the Golden Legend reads. And so that's what Caravaggio is supposed to be getting in this particular image. And so he uses a lot of devices and really does this in his own way. So the closest he can get, he had to have the angel on the cloud. So he pops the angel up there. And you almost see kind of like a, why did I have to put this in here? Kind of feeling. But it's important, and he's still able to utilize it for his effect, bringing down the palm, descending from on high, which Matthew, as if he's in a dream between the last moments of this life and the next one. So, and you have these half-naked figures here. These are the guys who are going to get baptized, or were going to get baptized. And this one was basically a pagan hiding in the group. But then you have these guys in their modern clothing. What are they doing? So there's a motif that he's using that would have also been familiar to all his viewers, a back alley stabbing somewhere in Rome. Right? That's what it looks like. Apart from the nakedness of the figures, it looks like some back alley hit. Which was not uncommon in those days, even as far back as the Roman Empire. There's some alleys, if you went down by accident, you wouldn't come out again. Right? Same thing in Renaissance Rome. So you have these figures kind of shocked and horrid, but there's a theological development that he's using here. Down here is the baptismal pool. That's where these guys are all supposed to be baptized in, right? And Matthew the Apostle, his blood is coming down into the pool. Right? So if you think of baptism again, we talked about this earlier, St. Thomas teaches the res tantum, that is the very thing that baptism signifies is death. And in martyrdom, you get a sort of, and some people used to talk that way, we don't really talk this way anymore because the term has another signification that the church wants to focus on, baptism of blood, which normally when we say that we mean martyrs who died, that confessed Christ, were going to be baptized but were martyred before they could get it, like St. Emerenciana on January 23rd. We have a saint not baptized. Right? Baptized by blood. So the other use of that term refers here to Matthew in his martyrdom getting the very thing that baptism signifies, that regeneration, that rebirth with Christ through his death. So he's managed to get this element, this device, the blood in the pool, to remind us actually of his baptism of blood, what you're going to meet. And then so in the front and center, strobe lit so you can't see him, is the naked assassin, right? But then you look over here. Caravaggio paints himself, not as a hero, but running away. Why does Caravaggio paint himself running away from this most holy moment? It's somewhat biographical, because he's trapped between, in his particular pathos, he's trapped between what he wants to see, what he knows from this careful training, this really inventive, genius look at the world and its sacred life and realities, and where he really is, which is not in a holy place or living a good life. But he wants to, so he's between both worlds. We'll see a little bit more of that when we get into his police records. But so he paints himself running away because the genius, the artist, is the villain. And that's why, and he knows he's a villain. And that's something else he wants you to see. He knows he's the villain. So artists, usually when they look in the mirror, they like what they see. Caravaggio does not. Okay. But then after this, though, this makes him famous. People go into the church and they see these, and they're thunderstruck by how amazing it is. Even his rivals, as much as they wanted to criticize him, they had to admit that there was something powerful about these images that people just, people are weeping, people are going to confession. This is exactly what the church is hoping to get, right? And so, but when Caravaggio looks in a mirror, he still is not satisfied with what he sees. So he paints the inverse. I don't want to look in the mirror. So here is, of course, his one-time mistress, Phillida Melandroni. Phillida Melandroni was a model for a lot of Caravaggio's paintings. You see her often. She shows up. She has an interesting life. She used to mock this one convent that was there for reformed prostitutes. So she used to mock it. But then later in life, she ended up being married to a marquis, and she ended up leaving the entire estate to that convent to help reform prostitutes. So sometime in her life, something positive happened anyway, one hopes. In the meantime, anyway, working for Caravaggio, she depicts at least a couple of times Mary Magdalene and other times St. Catherine. So here she is as the repentant Magdalene, the Magdalene who's holding the flower of her repentance. And here is the mirror, or the looking glass, because in those days, mirrors didn't have the perfection they have today, right? That's a modern marvel. Back then, the mirror was the speculum, literally, is the looking glass, because you look in it and you could see mostly, it's just like looking in, a piece of glass somewhere. You could see your reflection faintly, but not exactly like you're looking in a mirror, where you see it absolutely perfect. So that's the looking glass. And so this is vanity. You see this little green shade here. This has been covering it up. And so she takes it off to show that everything in here is vanity, right? And so, but I am repentant now, even though in real life the model was not. But the aspect of the Magdalene converting, it's a huge thing in theology and in Scripture, looking at that conversion from the bad life, at least in the Western tradition, by the way. Because in the Eastern tradition, they hold Mary Magdalene as a separate woman from the sinful woman and the other figures that she's identified with. So here is a really powerful one. This is in the Palazzo Barberini, if you ever get the chance to go to it in Rome. So the Judith and Holofernes. So if you don't know that biblical story, the Holofernes is this Assyrian general who's been sent by the Babylonians to reduce Jerusalem because they haven't been paying their tribute. And so he's camped outside with his army. So Judith goes out dressed as a prostitute, and she gets led into his camp. Then she gets him drunk, and then in the midst of his drunken stupor, she cuts off his head. And in the biblical story, then she stands on the wall with his head, and all the Assyrians look out. Well, wait, where is he? They find his headless body back in the tent, and they get terrified without their general and panic and run away. So she's declared, "You are the joy of our people." Right? And so that in a lot of the ways, it's a type of the Blessed Virgin Mary, actually, in spite of all its gruesome details. So one of the things that you would do in those days is you would watch beheadings, you would watch capital punishment, because that would give you a sense of the anatomy of how blood flows, when and in what ways, and you get a sense to put it into paint. And so that's one thing artists used to be encouraged to do, was watch a lot of beheadings. And so here he's got, again, Phillida Melandroni as Judith. There's a bunch of elements in here. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to bring them in. I might modify what I was going to say. But so she's cutting off his head, really intent on it. Who's the woman here? She's like, come on, go on, right? That's her maidservant, because a woman, a maiden, always had an ancilla, a maidservant, who would be with her to basically, ensure her chastity, keep her out, give her direction, get her out of bad places and stuff. But here, she's a part of the plan to do the assassination, because if she was doing her job, she'd never be there. And so, but while Caravaggio is exploring a whole different pathos here, is that the Greeks talk about ho thanatos kai hiatos, right? Death and lust. And the whole motif of where this is happening is an encounter between a man and a prostitute. So there's at least what's supposed to have been happening, but it's cut short, literally. And while Judith is working on this, there's certain signs he shows, such as what her breasts are doing. There's a firmness there, and it's the only, because you can't show any kind of nudity. So for Caravaggio, it's the only motif he can bring this in. Talk about there's a connection between those two those two appetites and they've noticed this in psychology. There's actually a number of psychological papers on it, between death and lust. And for some reason, there's a connection between the two that really still isn't understood. And the Greeks talked about it way back in ancient times, so he's trying to explore it. Now, this was the reason why she was there, at least ostensibly, but she's still feeling something from it in the actual execution. And that's why you see, like, with all so much sacking and pillaging by soldiers, there's usually a lot of rape associated with it because of this particular pathos. It's very odd. And so he's kind of looking into it, but he doesn't have any particular resolution from it. So, and then anyway, so the blood streaming out, this poor guy is not having a very good time. So it embodies a lot of violence that Caravaggio is also used to. He comes from a life. He wasn't born a thug, but that's how he ends up. And like I said, he's also exploring, how do I get out of thuggery? Can Christ get me out of thuggery? And for here, so this is the deposition of Christ from the cross, the laying aside from the cross. It used to hang in Santa Maria Vallicella, which is also known as Chiesa Nuova, St. Philip Neri's church. St. Philip Neri is buried in that church. It's right on the Corso Emanuele. If you just go right down the road leading from St. Peter's and go over the bridge, and it's easy to get to. You'll be on that road. And anyway, so it's in the Vallicella, and the Oratorians had commissioned the painting, and it used to hang over a side altar. Okay, and so over this side altar, it was at the exact point where when the priest raised the host during Mass, it would be lined up. So the sunlight would come above, and then the gleam from the sunlight would kind of, laminate in a way, illuminate the painting, and the host would be like right in front of it. So it would be connecting the host with the body of Christ being laid down. It was perfect for its architectural setting. Then it was stolen by Napoleon. Then it went to France. Then eventually it came back to Rome, and when it came back to Rome, Pope Leo XII, not 13th, grabbed it up for the Vatican museums and gave the Oratorians a copy, which they weren't happy about. But what do you do? It's the Pope. So it kind of stuck. So it's in the Vatican museums now, and in the Pinacoteca. But so part of what's going on, so you see in the back, there's Phila de Melendrona again, is Mary Magdalene, just completely losing it, almost like in a frenzy over Christ being killed. Our Lady in the background, silent and in prayer. And that's actually an element Caravaggio has gotten correct in theology, because Our Lady is immaculately conceived, because she is so perfect. All of her passions are rightly in order. So she will feel sorrow as an act of the will. Right? And so, thy heart a sword shall pierce. Right? Our Lady standing at the foot of the cross has to consent to her son's death, and the way she feels that more intensely than any human being ever could. And that's what the doctrine of co-redemptrix is. The woman who stands with the Redeemer. That's what that actually means. Doesn't mean she redeems with Christ. She means but she participates in his redemption in a way that's unique that none of us can. And so she's holding on to that emotion, that raw emotion. And then Nicodemus, is actually his friend, Longhi, I can't remember his first name right now. Anyway, laying Christ down, but the weight of the body of the Son of God is just pulling him down. It's so much. And then, of course, the hand again, the Michelangelo fresco once again, the new Adam. Again, the calling card, I'm going to beat you, Michelangelo. I am, really. He gets another commission in Santa Maria del Popolo, which is in the north end of the city, not far from the Via Borghese, where a lot of Caravaggio's paintings hang. We'll talk about how that happens. So this is in a side chapel on the left side. St. Peter, bearing his load of cowardly guilt, has come back to the city, and now he's going to make good on his failure during the Passion. But he's not worthy, he says, to be crucified as Christ, so do it upside down. And so what's interesting is, too, the way in which he hasn't just painted what he's seeing. He's actually getting a few distinctive elements, particularly the way St. Peter's weight is kind of weighing him down, like his guilt from having denied Christ during the Passion. The servant here trying to help lift up his cross, dirty feet, right? As a kind of a shout out to poor people, right? Here, look, the way your feet look, I'm putting that into paint. I'm making something sacred out of the lives of the squalid. And here's the sinner, lifting, making sure that Peter is dead and executed. So they're hoisting him up, all these ruffians, not unlike the ruffians you might see around the city. And in St. Peter himself was actually Orazio Gentilieschi's, the model, and that's a friend of his. She's actually the father of one of the most famous female artists, Artemisia Gentilieschi. I'd love to talk about her too, but there's just no time. So anyway, so he's being raised up, and St. Paul being thrown down. So there's St. Paul blinded. And of course, I mean, it doesn't say in Scripture he had a horse, but it's been a tradition and a convention of art that he's thrown off his horse. You have his eyes like scales. You know, you can't see. Thrown down, you know, and the light is coming, like in the scriptural relation where, you know, I mean, nobody could see where it was coming from. So the light is kind of a natural device to illustrate Christ speaking to Saul, who was on his way to Damascus at that time. So it's using the natural angles. Now, how does Caravaggio do this? How does he get all these incredible light angles and things? So this is a technique that's called chiaroscuro, literally light and dark. And what that does is that you use elements of the dark to shade and to hide and others to light in a way that's not done. So most Renaissance paintings that we saw, it's pretty bright, isn't it? A lot of them, the colors are more vibrant, but more importantly, there's more light shining in them. But here, the light is being focused very carefully. Okay. So how did he do that? Well, a lot of people think he used a camera oscura. We talk about a camera, right? Something we think we take pictures with, but in Italian, camera means a room. So camera oscura is a dark room, and that's where you would try, the first people would try to introduce little bits of light. So they had one experiment where they actually put a glass outside and covered it up, and had people sit in the dark, and then they would open it up so the sunlight would reflect through the glass, these people playing, these children playing, on the wall. So it looked like TV. So for a 17th century person, it scared the living daylights out of them. They ran out of the room. But so those are the experiments that eventually produced the camera. And that's why we have it, because you needed a camera oscura, dark room, to develop it. And that's where we get the word camera in the English language to what we talk about. Okay. But anyway, so Caravaggio might have used one of those, but nobody's really sure. There is one police report, though. At one point, he got involved in something really bad, so he fled to Genoa for a couple of months. And he came back and found himself locked out of his house. The landlady said, "You haven't paid me in 6 months." And according to the complaint, he had put a hole in her roof. And that's one of the things she wanted payment for. So Caravaggio had to go in court and settle this in order to get his stuff back. But because he was also assaulting the woman's house, throwing stones at her windows and everything. So, but anyway, what this kind of shows, or at least it's pretty good anecdotal evidence that he might have set up his room with control the light source by cutting a hole in the ceiling. So at certain times of the day, he could get the light just right and then paint that light, which is how it comes out into these paintings. Other times, you know what? I should have used the other. I should have used one from the internet. That's mine. That's from the Church of San Agostino, and which is in the heart of the city. Great church to go into. Saint Monica is buried there. And here, so you have on the side pilgrims coming to their Italian Jerusalem, coming to Rome, and come into this church, and they have an image, a reflection of themselves, dirty feet and all, right? So they're looking up at the Lady of Loreto, who is actually a local barmaid, who gets them into trouble for other things later, the model that is, and she's looking down at these pilgrims who've humbly come, walking sticks, dirty feet, tread all these miles. So now the pilgrim, the average person, is now also sacralized in this great painting as testimony to pilgrims. So then the real trouble comes for Caravaggio. So he's got this big reputation. The church commissions are coming in. He's got a lot more money. It starts to go to his head. So he leaves Cardinal Del Monte's house, although he still gets protection from Del Monte at various times, and is kind of living on his own. So then the Jesuits are building one of the first major church constructions in Rome since Philip Neri's Vallicella was the first one, and now this is the second one. It's getting massive, way bigger than anything that's been done for hundreds of years in the city, apart from St. Peter's. So the Jesu, which is built over the house of St. Ignatius of Loyola, really fantastic church if you go into it. St. Francis Xavier's arm that's traveling around right now, usually that's there on the right side, and then the St. Ignatius on the left. St. Robert Bellarmine used to be buried in there until he was beatified, and then he was transported to San Ignazio, where he's buried not too far from St. Aloysius Gonzaga, which was, according to his wishes, just took him 300 years to do it. So the Jesu needed a high altar, and they needed an intrepid young painter to paint this glorious, beautiful high altar. So Caravaggio, sure, he was the guy to get the job, and he labored, he worked on all kinds of things for the commission, But in the end, it went to his rival, Giovanni Baglione, who also did not like him very much. And Baglione, then of course Baglione's piece ended up being deemed unworthy, and that was thrown out of there too, and they got somebody else. But in the meantime, so Baglione gets the plum job. The one that everyone, the only thing better than this is getting a piece in St. Peter's. And so Caravaggio is just really angry. So at some point, he and his friends in the bar concocted, at least they think, there's no evidence he did directly, but they think he did, concocted these poems, really bad poems, I might add. That's why I'm not going to be quoting them. There's too many uses of the 16th century bad words to put in. But mocking Baglione, call him Bagman, that's what Baglione sort of comes out to, and make various jokes about him in a lot of immoral ways. And so it makes the round of Rome's rougher taverns. So Baglione sues Caravaggio for libel, because he's sure that Caravaggio's done it. So Caravaggio gets picked up, thrown in prison, and he's, for about almost a year, this trial's going on. It was like the OJ trial of the day, really. Because everyone was paying attention to it, all these witnesses, it was going on forever. Finally, there wasn't sufficient evidence, and they basically let Caravaggio off under a temporary house arrest, and they say, all right, behave yourself or you'll be doing a stint as a galley slave. Well, he kind of does. And so now the next commission he gets is this one, really phenomenal work. It's in the Borghese Museum now, unless I'm that's right, it is in Borghese. Borghese got it. We'll talk about that later. So the betrayal, the kiss of Judas. We saw Giotto's treatment from 300 years earlier. But now what he's done is he's given you a sense, a feeling of the force of the arrest of Christ, which culminates in the kiss. That's where the realism he's got, so they're all, so he represents, of course, the Jewish guards. Now he's painted what they thought were Romans. That's a lot of the way Romans are painted often. And they're coming in to grab our Lord. And here's Judas, which is painted to look like a real scoundrel of a man, right? And someone would betray his brother. And what better person to betray the Son of God? So all the force kind of comes in, and Christ, who's meditative, sorrowful, but also in control of himself, remember, because he's God. His passions are all perfectly in order. And so, but he knows what's going to happen, like a resignation to it. And back here, an apostle fleeing, right? Possibly St. Mark, possibly St. James, nobody knows, but fleeing away, right? So it was a really wonderful painting to actually contemplate the power of the humiliation that Christ had to endure. And then there's this one, the Supper at Emmaus, and this was another church commission. Now it's in the London Gallery, and I forget the origins of how that all happens. Okay, so anyway, a couple of the things he's done here. So the waiter doesn't know him from Adam. These are the disciples at Emmaus. Remember, they didn't recognize him until at the breaking of the bread, that very last moment. What Caravaggio has done, he's captured that very moment where the disciples at Emmaus see him and they recognize who he is, and then just before he disappears. But the bartender, the waiter there, he doesn't really catch on. He's just looking down. Okay, so the guy is here. What do you guys want? They understand it's our Lord, and this is something phenomenal. So one of the interesting devices he's used. So if you look at the canestra here, the fruit is about to fall off. So it's kind of, you see the shadow does the job perfectly. It looks like it's about to fall off. He's jumping out of his chair. Wow, it's the Lord. And this is going to fall off, right? And then you have this hand, which cuts off right here. Just actually the shot of the one in the London Gallery, the way it's framed. You see the fingers are being kind of cut off. They're not fully represented in the portrait. Because, again, Caravaggio is demolishing the difference between our space and the painting space. And so trying to invite you in. You're not just a spectator to what's happening. You are right there in the room as Christ is now being made, understood, recognized by his disciples that didn't recognize him. And now they have a sense of it. Of course, the breaking of the bread, obviously they knew him in the breaking of the bread, right? Eucharistic illusion there. So Caravaggio, so he's kind of back and forth. And you could see, he sees this sacred life in these amazing scenes. And his friends kind of marvel how he can paint these religious scenes and be such a crazy psychopath. Here's a document from the Rome Central Archives, which is the testimony of the policeman who arrested him. He says that, it's written in Latin, he says that, walking down the Corso, I found one Michelangelo Caravaggio wearing a sword and dagger. I stopped him and asked if he had a license. He said no, so we took him to the precinct, and then of course they've made a little drawing of the sword and dagger just in case they might have been stolen. Right, so he took him down to the police headquarters, the Spari, that is, the papal police in Rome. And so they mentioned other things that he'd done there. Other times, it's different types of bad behavior. There was a man named Pasqualone, who was a lawyer. And he had taken an interest in one of Caravaggio's models. So he had said some things about Caravaggio to the woman's mother, say, you want to associate with a ruffian like that. So Caravaggio blows his fuse, challenges the man to a duel. He won't wear a sword by day, so then at night, he stabs him from behind, right? And then no one is in doubt, even though no one saw him, nobody doubts who did it. And eventually, Caravaggio got brought before the Pope's nephew, who was the one who ran papal justice, bought him off of some paintings. And so also Del Monte's pulling for him. So he manages, again, to stay out of jail. There's more cases that happen. So now he's going to try to stay on the straight and narrow for a while. So he gets this great commission in Trastevere, which is just a little bit north from the Ottaccio, right? So it's where, really poor district, where the kind of people that he knows, that he rubs elbows with, and that he wants to glorify in some way. And so the Carmelites ask for a painting of the Assumption, or the Dormition. And this is what Caravaggio paints. Again, the convention, we all know that the teaching about the Dormition is Our Lady made more or less a fleshless exit from this life, right? So not dying and rotting in the ground, but passing right into heaven, body and soul. So Caravaggio has tried to capture the moment in a different way. And this painting is now in the Louvre, and we'll explain why that happened. So he paints it and gives the sense of Our Lady as being dead. And he's departed from the tradition with blue. She's wearing a red dress, but she's screaming dead, not just, like passing like you see in iconography, ready to pass to the next life. She's really dead. Mary Magdalene wept over, the apostles too, in great sorrow, because wherever she is, she's leaving this life. And so the moment is the loss, the sadness of that physical loss of the embodiment of the Mother of God, going to heaven, as it were. And yet, at the same time, he really gives off the sense that she's dead. So this shocks the Carmelites, and they bring in the priests, and they look at it, and they're kind of nervous about it. Then, come to find out, the model for the Virgin was actually a prostitute who drowned. A Caravaggio used her model out of the morgue. So the Carmelites gave the painting back. And Caravaggio was upset. Later, it ended up in his things, and a Medici art dealer bought it up. And eventually, through some trading, it found its way into France, and where it's now in the Louvre, actually, if you can see it direct there. But so that was a big blow. But the next thing was worse. So Caravaggio gets a commission for St. Peter's, Pope Paul V. His name, by the way, Paulus Borgesius Quintus, it's right up on the front of St. Peter's. If you go, that's whose name is up there. Because he's the one who finally says, all right, we got to finish it. So he frustrates Michelangelo's plan, the final plan that was supposed to be executed for it, which was a Greek cross. Perfectly, ordered in all its portions, every side of it. And instead, he says, you know what, we need a nave for procession. So we're going to elongate the nave. We're going to make it bigger. So he brings it, and of course, the net effect of it is when you stand in St. Peter's Square and you look up, it's hard to see the dome. That's why Michelangelo had it designed as a Greek cross to work with the dome, so that you could see this thing towering up, but now when you stand in front, you can barely even see it. So it's a big architectural flaw. It's been noted for a number of years. Nevertheless, Paul V pushing forward. We're going to finish St. Peter's and get it done with. So the nave is brought out, and to commemorate it, he wants paintings in St. Peter's. And Caravaggio, this is about 1607 now. And so as the biggest artist of the day, is commissioned to get a painting in there. And so he's very careful to pay attention to all the theological elements. So this was done for the Pontefieri, who were a guild devoted to St. Anne. And so what they're doing is that moment of triumph, where through Anne, Our Lady crushes the serpent. But there's a trick here. So the Vulgate reads, ipsa caput conteret, she shall crush your head, and you shall lie in wait for her heel. Now the Hebrew, according to many testimonies, so there's some debate about this, but the Hebrew says, he shall crush, because the antecedent is actually the seed, which is Christ. And so it makes sense that he would crush the head. So anyway, so these debates are going on. Well, which one's right? Do we follow the Vulgate? Do we look at the Hebrew? What do we do? And so Caravaggio cuts through all of that by saying it was both. It was both the Blessed Virgin and Christ that crushed the head of the serpent. Right? And so he's been really careful to keep within the boundaries of what's theologically orthodox, because this has got to get in St. Peter's, right? There's a couple of things he didn't count on. First of all, the guild devoted to St. Anne felt she was too withered and too old. She wasn't made to look beautiful. Caravaggio's thinking, I'm just going to paint a venerable old woman. And so the guild that commissioned the painting was offended by it, but it gets worse. So this is Lena, the girl from the Lady of Loretto, the Pilgrim painting, right? And she has a rather large chest, which in those times, see, in modern times, people wouldn't have a problem with that. But in those times, that was seen as indecent, especially for the Blessed Virgin Mary. You're making her look like some low barmaid, right? We can't have that. And so there was a big row over it. The censors, the deacons, they thought that this painting should not be in because of that element. They felt the Blessed Virgin was indecently depicted. St. Anne, the patrons felt was too old. So they make a big row over it, and Pope Paul V says, all right, throw it out. So the painting was returned. And so Caravaggio had a short fuse. Italian temper doesn't even begin to cover it. In an age where your code of honor, your manhood code of honor, your sense of your own self-dignity is really important. People get into fights over like the smallest little slights and then impart upon them what's called a sfregio, some kind of scar to show them that they've wronged them in some way, and I'm fixing it by doing this fixing this to you forever. Right, and that's it's a complicated thing in the code of honor that day. All right, Caravaggio is at a restaurant and orders artichokes, and so the waiter comes out with a bowl of artichokes. 4 of them are done up in oil, 4 of them are done in butter, and so Caravaggio says, "Are they done in butter or oil?" And the waiter looks at him and he says, "Why don't you smell them yourself?" Right? And then Caravaggio laughs and he curses him a few times and says, "What do you think? You're talking to some kind of bum?" According to another report, it says, "You think you're talking to some kind of criminal?" And then he throws the artichokes up, assaults the waiter, beats him, and then starts shoving the artichokes in the guy's face. Until he says, "Yeah, smell him, why don't you?" And he's just absolutely going crazy, cuts him with his dagger. So the guy runs straight to the police. And so we have the police report about that one too. Right, so so again, it's got a rap sheet as long as your arm. He's always in trouble. Oh yeah, Caravaggio, again, we got your cell open for you. And so again, the pathos, he's just got too much energy, too much violence, too much that he just hasn't worked out. And his art is often the place where he works out a lot of these different ideas. And so, or waiters' faces, depending on his mood. So he gets. So the next thing is a row with a guy named Tomasoni. And Tomasoni was part of the Tomasoni clan. It was like a rival mafia family of sorts. And Tomasoni had offended Caravaggio in some way in the past, and now Caravaggio had done something else. There's conflicting reports about it. Nobody knows exactly what happened. There's one report that Caravaggio was involved with Tomasoni's wife. There's another report that Tomasoni and Caravaggio were in an argument over his model, Phillida Melandroni. Nobody really knows, but they set up a duel. Now, the story they gave to the authorities is that, they just randomly started fighting. But the reality is they set up a duel. They all had their seconds, and they met at the tennis courts on the Via della Scroffa. Now, today, it's a mechanic shop. It's just a little further north from a toy store. But the mechanic shop, actually, there's some places of it where you can still see where it used to be a tennis court. And that's where they had the great duel. So Caravaggio and Tomasoni duel it out. And in the end, Caravaggio defeats Tomasoni, and what he was trying to do, again, he's trying to inflict a sfregio, a scar in the manhood code of honor of that day. He was trying to castrate him. That's what he was trying to do. Right? And it shows quite of the nature that whatever they are arguing over was probably of carnal relations in nature. So he tries to castrate him, and he misses and hits the femoral artery. And so Tomasoni is taken back to his house. He's given last rites, and he dies. Caravaggio, on the other hand, flees because he knows what's waiting for him, because he was in a duel already against the law, and so he's murdered a man now. So now that he's really up the ante, so he flees the city altogether. And in his absence, he's sentenced to bundo capitale. Show up with his head in the basket, and you get the reward. So all the bounty hunters are out looking for him. So it's a complete death sentence. So Caravaggio makes contact with the Pope's nephew, the administrator of papal justice, Scipione Borghese. Now he really wasn't much interested in administering papal justice, unless he had to. He was more interested in using his immense wealth to get his art collection. And in the past, he freed Caravaggio from what would have been certain stints as a galley slave, just in exchange for paintings. So now, Caravaggio offers to send him a painting. Right, and Borghese is interested. Ultimately, he doesn't do it because of the fact that Tomasoni's got people who are too powerful. Okay, I'm going to wrap that up. So he sends him this, or he doesn't send it yet, but he prepares this for him. A guilty plea in paint. He paints himself as the monster Goliath. Right, so it's a self-portrait. Back to that. All right, we'll just go with that. I was talking to him. No, sorry. So he gives to Borghese a guilty plea in paint. You can have my head. Here it is. Just let me keep it in real life, please, if you don't mind. So Borghese is interested, and it probably wants a few more paintings out of it, but the Tomasones are just too powerful, so it doesn't work. So he starts getting his friends and patrons, and he makes his way to Naples, Napoli, where cutting someone's throat is really nothing to get worked up about. And I'm not really being facetious, it's true. So Napoli was run by the Spanish, and the Spanish ran the city as much as possible with an iron fist, because there were about 750,000 people resident in the city, compared to Rome's 120,000. So it's a much more populous city, a lot of mix of various people of various backgrounds, and so a lot of poverty everywhere, and as well as Spanish aristocracy. There's a lot of Spanish customs in Naples still, even to this day, but a lot of crime, mafia stuff, and so Caravaggio is an instant celebrity. Wow, you killed someone? Great, come on in. And so, but he's working his way out. So I didn't put it in here because in the time constraints too, but he does the Supper of Emmaus again, except this time it's dimmer and darker, probably because he's doing it from memory. And the Christ in it is fading, almost like now he's murdered a man, and he sees this religious ideal he's been trying to get to is now fading away from him. One time he walked up the steps to a church, and there was a priest outside with holy water, and then he asked Caravaggio if he likes it. So, well, what is it? He said, it's holy water. He said, well, what does it do? He said, oh, it forgives your venial sins. And he says, oh, no, Father, won't work for me. Mine are all mortal. So he's got this keen awareness. Why doesn't he just go in for confession? Is he not sorry? Probably he's afflicted by a lot of emotional distress from childhood, where he just feels like he can't be forgiven. Probably. But then again, nobody really knows that for sure. So he paints for Franciscans, he paints in Naples for private clients, for aristocratic clients. So the Franciscans ask him for a painting of the 7 works of mercy, corporal works of mercy. The 7 things. So there's a lot of interesting things. So they wanted it all in one painting. And that's hard to do, because there's a lot of different things. But the genius in which Caravaggio is able to bring it out, okay? So going right to left. So a lot of people, this is in a church, say Mass under this altar. So this particular element didn't bother anyone in its own day. Although when you think of arguments on Facebook about whether mothers should breastfeed in public or whatnot, you can think of, all right, this is going to cause problems. But this is a allusion to classical antiquity. Kimon is thrown in jail, right, and is without nourishment. So his daughter, whose breasts are full, comes and brings him milk. So she's feeding the hungry, and gets visiting, while I was in prison. It's all done in one, right? You've got over here, this fellow is dead. He saw Naples and he died. He saw the sight. So they're leading him out. The pallbearers are leading him away. So burying the dead, okay? Clothing the naked. So it's just almost like St. Martin's cloak there. And so he's brought the elements, together, kind of compacted, just like the city itself feels compacted. But now there's an interesting note as to Caravaggio's religious mood at this point. Here's the angel. What's the angel doing? Almost like he's crushing everybody down. And so he feels, in this sense, that, almost like God's crushing everybody down, putting us in these horrible situations. Possibly. Or maybe that's one interpretation that's given to it. The other is the angels coming in together to bless the whole thing. Right? One way or the other, there's kind of that ominous kind of note of the divine watching human activity and human mercy. But anyway, so this painting, as well as a number of others, it makes Caravaggio famous in Naples, and they're really excited to have him. But there's one thing he's looking for that he can't quite get, and that's prestige. Plus, being a convicted murderer doesn't help with prestige. So through his patrons, he makes his way to Malta. Now, Malta is where the Knights of St. John are. In 1565, they won a resounding victory against the Turks, who tried to invade the island, tried to outnumber them at least 10-1, and yet the Knights of Malta stood in spite of it. So they're heroes. They're celebrated for that. So they've settled another part of the island where they built up a cathedral, St. John's Co-Cathedral, and that's going to be their chapter house for postulants. And the problem they're having in Malta is they can't get painters to come down and paint because it's a backwater. And if you've ever been there, it takes you a little while coming from Naples or coming from Sicily, where you usually have to stop around Palermo or something. It takes a while, and then it's just a little place, kind of out. You can almost see it in the distance. It looks like this tiny little thing that someone just go over and ping, and go away. And then it's on top of it, the island is very rocky. Byron, the English poet Byron, he had club feet. He was born with club feet, so he always complained about the stairs, Malta and its cursed stairs. He worked it in about 3 poems, I think. And he just, it is rocky. There's a lot of stairs, a lot of climbing. You go up and you feel like, oh my goodness, I don't know if I can keep doing this. So painters don't want to go there. It's not this luxurious place, and pilgrims are not going to make their way there and see your work. So what's the motivation? Well, they don't really have one. So Caravaggio's patrons come knocking, and the Grand Master, the French Grand Master, Wignacourt, he's like, well, now this is an opportunity. So normally being a convicted murderer would prevent you from getting into a crusading order such as the Knights of Malta. Right? But Caravaggio is not exactly going in to fight the Turks. There's a different thing, and there's an exchange. So Wignacourt wants a painter. Caravaggio wants recognition and at least a public forgiveness, which he can get if he joins the Knights. So, because they have to get a papal dispensation, which will free him from the effects of all civil penalties before he can enter into the order. So Wignacourt, asks for some paintings, including this one. Really impressed. There's some other knights he paints for. He really seems to make it happen. So he lays this on Caravaggio. We'll let you in. We'll forgive you if you paint the Co-Cathedral on the east transept. And so he does. This is what he paints. There's the St. John's Co-Cathedral. You've got to see it at some point if you're ever in Malta. And then he paints this, the death of John the Baptist, which is movie screen size, 17 feet across, which is massive. But it's horrific. And so, but it's also what Caravaggio has to look forward to if he goes back to Rome. There's a lot of autobiographical elements in this. But anyway, so the biblical narrative, naturally, Salome dances before Herod to get from him that John the Baptist's head on behalf of her mother. So here she is with her lily white arm, ready to get that head in the basket. And there's obviously the jailer ordering to get done, and you have a perfect nude. Normally, a perfect nude is associated with beauty. It's associated with the pure form of man. And here, it's a butcher. Not only has he botched the beheading, but he's about to finish the job with this knife. It's the most horrific thing possible. St. John's already got the blood squirting out. It's just really horrific. And the prisoners back here just gluing their necks around the cage just to get a look at the action. But there's some other things Caravaggio's done. Modern interpretations of this painting like to represent it as a social justice painting, a commentary on the death penalty, right? Caravaggio is under the death penalty, so he's trying to talk about the evil of state-sanctioned murder. No, that's not what's going on. Caravaggio, nobody in this period had any issues with the death penalty as such. Rather, if we look at it again, this guy's dressed like a Turk. He's wearing Turkish jackets, Swahili. He's drawn up like a Turk, and he's commanding John the Baptist, the patron of the Knights of Malta, to be put to death. This is the chapter house where the young knights as postulants are being trained, so they can set their eyes on that. Why do I want to become a devoted, faithful knight? Because I don't want that to happen. Because it could, fighting for the order in the Turkish Mediterranean here. This could happen. But then you got this other thing here. So you have Salome, this white arm. What does that show? Nobility. She's not working hard in the sun. She's not tanned. And she has her maidservant with her. Again, she's royalty, going to a really seedy place, the jail. You need your maidservant with you. So Salome, who's done all this to perpetrate the death of John the Baptist, she's not fazed at all by the gruesomeness of what's happening here, but her maidservant is. And the maidservant's just about to scream, looking at the horror of it. So she kind of stands for piety, for Christian prayer, as well as a normal human reaction. Whereas the corrupted nobility, it isn't at all affected by this. What happens where what should be pure is not. Okay, and that's the kind of the strength of it. But there's one more bit of autobiography here. Because the only painting to which Caravaggio signs his name, all right, down here, Michelangelo, in the blood of John the Baptist. So what's happening is, as the blood of martyrdom washes away sins, the blood of John the Baptist washes away my sin, as in my murder. And being received into the Knights of Malta, I will now be spared. And so here's the document from the Knights, which was the Winya Court is officially recording the Pope's forgiveness of Caravaggio's crime, and not by name. He was careful to leave the name out. And so his entrance into the order. So, story ends, sinner saved, great painting, solves the day, except it's Caravaggio. And it doesn't work that way. There's an assault that takes place, and one of the administrators of the Knights Justice, named Rogero, gets assaulted. He gets shot in the leg during this. Caravaggio fell in with a bad group who were not happy about certain things. And so this assault happens. There's a deacon involved in the assault. It's a really messy thing. So Caravaggio is thrown here in the Guva because of his role in it. Nobody knows exactly the nature of his role. For a long time, even that detail, nobody knew. And so there were a lot of conspiracy theories about what was Caravaggio's crime? Did he worship the devil? Was he secret sodomite? Was it, what did the Knights of Malta do to him? Right? Because it's just unknown what he had actually done. Because the person who goes to settle scores with Caravaggio later had smeared all the documentation with pitch. And so they had those documents, but nobody read them and couldn't. Nobody got the idea of X-raying them until a priest in 2002 got the idea, working in the archives. So they X-rayed them and were able to find all the writing on the archives, all which pertain to Caravaggio and exactly what he did. So he was involved, he was one of the ringleaders in this assault on Rogero, one of the administrators of the Knights Justice. So he's thrown into the Guva, which used to be thought to have been filled in by the British, but they found it recently. You can still take a tour of it now, which is really horrifying to go down there. And it's you're walking with a torch. It's completely dark. They seal it up, and there's actually an inscription from a Scottish knight who had done some kind of sin. It's written in Latin. Forget what it says though. I couldn't find a picture of it as hard as I tried. So, but all kinds of really interesting, last words from people who died in there, basically. Now Caravaggio was going to be brought out eventually because Winyacourt needs the painter, and probably Caravaggio was upset because he realized now what Winyacourt was always intending. I'll let you in. I'll get you forgiven for your crime, and then you're going to stay here and paint for me. Whereas Caravaggio, on the other side, is thinking, I'll get status, I'll get forgiven for my crime, and I can go back to Rome as a knight. Won't that get Baglioni all worked up? It doesn't work that way. So somehow he escapes, which is thought to be impossible, which means he had help on the outside, which means there's still more that documents don't actually capture or record. So he makes his way out of the fortress off of Malta and back to Sicily, where again he becomes an instant celebrity. Now Sicily again is under Spanish rule and had been since the Sicilian Vespers, if you're familiar with that, where they break away from French rule and end up under Spanish rule. So this is a painting, the Denial of St. Peter. But notice it's not as sharp as his older painting, right? He's kind of on the downside. The reason for this is after he had been at a bar in Naples and he gets beat up very badly, left for dead practically. And after that, he doesn't have the same command of his powers. Now, there's a bunch of things. It was a seedy bar, but more importantly, the people who did it was Rogero and the Knights of Malta with him that were basically getting, the manhood code of honor, revenge on Caravaggio, and inflicted on him the sfregio. So the Knights had cast Caravaggio out of the order in absentia, and Winyacourt basically asked for a couple of paintings and washed his hands on him, and he said, okay, we're not going to call you back in, we're not going to go arrest you, but don't represent yourself as a knight, we'll just pretend this never happened. And so Caravaggio's on his own. Now, Rogero wasn't going to let that happen. That would be an affront to his manhood honor. Couldn't tolerate that. And later biographers, like 100 years later, like, well, Lord, you're trying to write about this. And they just clearly, they're baffled by this kind of code of honor. And so Rogero leaves his Sfregio and Caravaggio apparently cutting part of his jaw to a point where it was always exposed. So nobody knows the nature of his injuries, but it was so bad, he lost a lot of his painting ability. So St. Peter's got that, who me view from the Matthews. And as the maidservant accuses him and the guard comes in. And so it has that darkness and it has the dark feel of Peter denying Christ, but he's just, again, lacking all the devices he might have used for it. So anyway, recovering from this horrible injuries he's got, he gets word from Rome. Borghese is working on a pardon. All Caravaggio has to do is surrender all his current paintings and then paint some stuff for Borghese. Borghese was a big mover and shaker, being the Pope's nephew, A, but B, one of the biggest players on the art market. He gave Gian Lorenzo Bernini his start, for example. And Bernini, for a long time, was his sculptor. Bernini actually sculpted this for Borghese, which is now in the museum that bears his name. And so his old villa. So Caravaggio wraps up his stuff, gets on a boat, and gets north and heading to Rome. He ends up in Porto Ercole, off of which he's going to take the sea road and then head to Rome. He gets stopped there. The governor of the island confuses him with another criminal, locks him up. Once again, he's locked up. And so it's either some kind of misunderstanding or he hadn't heard about Caravaggio's pardon. Nobody knows which one. But so anyway, Caravaggio buys his way out. And when he gets out, his ship has sailed. It's already gone. Right? And without it, that's what he can't go back to Rome without those paintings. That's what's going to let Borghese give him the pardon, and he's going to be back to where he was, he hopes. So he gets a horse and starts riding down the coastline through the Maremma, the malarial-infested swampland all around that area. Baglioni, who was, remember, his rival, his enemy, Caravaggio wrote bad poems about, he decided that revenge was a dish best served cold, so he writes Caravaggio's first biography. And he adds in a lot of details that are not factual, not true. Tries to exaggerate the nature of Caravaggio's violence and sinfulness and stuff. But on the other hand, he's right about a few things. But here he tries to make Caravaggio look like a madman, saying he walked. There's just simply no way he could have done it. But Baglioni didn't know the terrain there very well. And if you ever end up in that area, it is pretty bad. So he would have needed a horse just to traverse it. And otherwise, it just doesn't. The account makes no sense whatsoever. So he makes his way, a little past Porto Ercole, and on the coast, trying to hail his ship vainly. And then eventually, he collapses from a fever. And as Baglioni puts it, without the help of God or man, died as miserably as he lived. Unquote. That's from Baglioni. And whatever the embellishment of those details, he died with no sacraments because the priest who over Porto Ercole was in jail. The Spanish had put him in jail for something. So there was nobody even recorded the death or where the body went, right? Which also for a long time led to a lot of theories about secret occult stuff in the church and catching up with him and things like that. Don't know quite what to make of that. But so Caravaggio died, and eventually his paintings made their way to Borghese. God got a hold of him, and so this, which he had tried to offer to buy his freedom 3 years later, comes in and gets set up, and Borghese looks at it. And it's just very disturbing. Not just, there's the old joke, hey, got my head, can I keep my real one now, right? That's the joke, but there's something more going on here. David is not a really jubilant victor. He's almost sorry that he had to do it. So the sword has that traditional inscription, Humilitas superbiam occidit, right? So humility slays pride. It's a classic device that's used on all David and Goliath stuff. So he's holding the head, and there's the Goliath Caravaggio and the David Caravaggio. So it's all black. No grace, no virtue. Just the truth about ourselves. That in each and every one of us, there is the David and the monster, Goliath. And for Caravaggio, he never found his way beyond the monster, Goliath, and he's at pains to struggle with it. So that's the power that he's trying to imbibe here. The truth about ourselves, that we could be either one. And now, I've been this one. Maybe I could be this one. It was too late. So, can't remember the first name. The last name is Landon, which is also called Caravaggio. Another really good book. Like familiar Father Zusseldorf, he promotes that book a lot. Sources for art and kind of art history and art symbolism. Even just searching on the internet, you can find a lot of good resources. So like for what the plants mean, what the different fruits mean. So if you search for like this, the meaning of fruit in Renaissance art, meaning of symbolism in Renaissance art, see what comes up. And because I'm just thinking, I have a couple of books. One book's in Italian. I can't remember the title. There are, let's see. What other books on art history? So I didn't have that prepared, so I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. Books you can work with. Let's see.
Kenneth Clark's Civilization.
Yeah, that would be good. That would work. William Durant in his History of Europe.
Kenneth Clark.
I'm sorry.
That's right. And William Durant in his History of Civilization, he'll talk about art. Sometimes he gets it wrong, sometimes he gets things right, but he has a lot of interesting commentary on different works. There's another great painter I wanted to do more on, but it didn't fit with the other things I was talking about. Peter Paul Rubens, and he's Flemish, and he's got a really interesting history, just as biography. But he was a really famous Catholic painter at the time. Is mocked a lot of times as a pagan painter because he paints a lot of pagan motifs, but he's very stoic. So he uses the traditional stories of mythology to teach about morality, what you're supposed to do. And so, but he's got a lot of really famous and interesting paintings. But Rubens, he's one of the most traded painters of the day. So there's a book on him called Master of Shadows. I can't remember, I think it's Lambert is the author's name. But it's a really good historical biography as well as painting analysis. Like I said, I wanted to bring in Rubens. I tried so hard, but I was already over time with so much else. So, and if you want, I